Hi, everybody. Julie here. I am very happy to be with Denis Rancourt, former professor of physics from the University of Ottawa and a researcher for the Ontario Civil Liberties Association. And the reason why I want to talk with Denis today is being so gracious. I know it's a really busy time, but Denis, along with Joseph Hickey, wrote a response piece to the paper that was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal on Monday, written by David Fissman. The title of this paper, if I could remember it, it was very long, but basically my recollection, right, is that one of the more subtle but problematic aspects of the COVID narrative has been this idea that the unvaccinated are dangerous, that they're to be feared, that they're to be hated. And that really got a boost with this article. And the study claims to have found that when the vaccinated and the unvaccinated mix, then the unvaccinated people contribute to the infections of those who are vaccinated. Have I got that part right?
That's not
Okay.
precise. It's complicated because it's a scientific paper, and I think the authors are relying on complexity and subtlety to not so that there's a lot of room for misinterpretation here of what they're actually saying.
Can we
Um,
start with modeling? Because
mhm.
I, as a non-scientist, hear this word modeling, mathematical modeling, epidemiological modeling. When I hear that a study has been done, I'm thinking, okay, trial participants, actual people enrolled. Is that what modeling is? And if not, can you explain what modeling is that's gone on in the study that's been?
Yeah, modeling is where you create a simulation of the world, of what's happening in the world. So you input what the conditions of that synthetic world are. You say, here's the synthetic world I'm going to build. Here are the interactions between the components, between the individuals in that synthetic society that I'm going to consider. Here are the parameters that parameterize that interaction. And then I'm going to allow time to advance within my simulation, and I'm going to see what happens as a function of time. I'm going to have initial conditions. I'm going to start the society out in certain conditions, and there are parameters that define the starting conditions. And then I will let time evolve in my simulation and see what happens. So it's a way of doing thought experiments, if you like, with the help of a computer in order to see what would happen if this were true. Okay, so it's a very powerful tool in science. It's very useful. You can test a hypothesis that way. You can say, well, if this is the reality, if these are the correct mechanisms, and they have these magnitudes and relative importance, here's what we know from what we know of science and the mechanisms. Here's what should happen in a society under these assumptions of our model. Okay, so modeling is very powerful. But it is, physicists like to say that there's a limit, there's a fundamental limit to modeling, and the limit is usually expressed in crude terms as follows: garbage in, garbage out. In other words,
Depends what you input, what kind of
yeah,
data.
if you have the wrong parameters, you can't expect the outcome to be representative of something real. And more importantly, if your model is not realistic in terms of the interactions and its structure, then it's not modeling anything in society anyways. Okay, so there's two aspects. There's the parameters that you would use to characterize the mechanisms, and then there's the structure of the model and whether it correctly takes into account the actual interactions.
Right.
And Brittle's criticism of the Fissman article concentrates on the parameters.
Okay.
Our criticism of the Fissman article concentrates on the structure of the model, because we found a fundamental error in the structure that allows us to conclude that his main conclusion does not follow from what he did, from his model. Okay, so that's a silver bullet criticism. That is the kind of criticism that should put an end to the article at the review process. That's the kind of criticism that when an editor sees that criticism, the editor is supposed to say, wait a minute, there's a fatal flaw here. You need to answer this before we can proceed. And so there is a fatal flaw. So the question is, did the reviewers spot the fatal error? Did they notify the editor? And if they did, that the editor decide to override that comment from one or two or more reviewers. So those are the questions in the review process that would have arisen. But the point is, we as outside people reading the final product, the published article, we can say, given what's written here, given the description of their model, there is a fundamental structural error in the model that is such that you cannot make this conclusion. And you asked at the beginning, well, what is the conclusion that they're making? And that's an important point, okay? So the conclusion is not what many people would think, that unvaccinated people infect vaccinated people. That's a given. In the narrative that's accepted by most people, that's just a given. That's just reality. Okay, if you're infectious for whatever reason, whether you're vaccinated or not, you can infect someone else, whether they're vaccinated or not. Okay, so that's a given, but that's not the point they're making. The point they're making is that unvaccinated people are contributing to vaccinated people becoming infected in greater proportion to the contacts that they have with.
So that's like they count for more than one person almost, or something.
Yes, like yes. In other words, the way that they transmit, the way that unvaccinated people transmit infection is more virulent than if you were getting the infection from a vaccinated person. That's the kind of what they're trying to imply.
So if you were vaccinated and you were exposed to both a vaccinated person and an unvaccinated person, and you happened to contract the virus from the unvaccinated person, you would get much more sick than
No, that's not the point. No, that's not the point. No, it's not that you would get more sick.
Okay.
Let's say you have 3 contacts with an unvaccinated person. Let's say you're vaccinated and you have 3 contacts with an unvaccinated person. Then is the risk of you getting infected proportional to 3? And if it were 6, would it be twice that, and so on? Well, he's saying that the risk that you get infected is more than proportional to 3. Okay, it's as though you had been in contact with more people than 3. In my example, okay, that's the main conclusion of the paper. So he's saying that the risk of infection is more than proportional to the contacts you have with those darn unvaccinated people. So they are particularly dangerous in that sense, in terms of getting the infection. That is the main conclusion of the paper. That conclusion does not follow from what is actually done in the paper. That is an incorrect statement that Fishman et al. Are making. It's not that the statement is incorrect. It's that it does not follow from what they did and the parameters that they introduced. It does not follow. You cannot make that conclusion on the basis of their model.
This is not, I looked through the article that you wrote for the OCLA, and I've read through Byram's article as well. And these are not papers that are easily accessible for the non-specialist, nor maybe should they be, because it's important that we have rigorous scientific debate in the public sphere. But I really want to sort of try to push you today on understanding for the average person, what is at stake in this kind of debate. And one thing I often wonder is, where is the data that scientists like Fishman et al. And you and Byram, where is it? Where do you get it that you input into these models? I mean, if the average person wants to know something like, what is the rate of infection for a vaccinated versus an unvaccinated person? We hear about the non-sterility of these vaccines all the time. Well, what do we know about the seriousness of illness that's happening? Where do we get that information from?
Oh my. Well, okay. Okay. Well, here I'll try to put it in a nutshell. That's a big, broad question, but I'll try to put it in a nutshell. First, I want to answer the first part of your question, which was a comment more than a question, which is this idea that it's hard for regular people and journalists to understand our articles, our criticisms of this article and the article itself. And I want to say the following about that. it's much easier to follow what Byram is saying in his criticism than it is what we're saying in our criticism,
Well, you
because
have
we're
charts and
making a
graphs.
fundamental criticism about the mathematical structure of the model. Okay.
Right.
And so that no journalist could have understood that this ad hoc parameter that they were introducing was a nonsense parameter and couldn't be used in the way that they were using it. No journalist could have really saw that with their minds. Okay, I don't think.
I
Yeah,
couldn't see that.
it takes high level scientists to really think about what's going on here and to discuss it and to really pinpoint that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with Byram's criticism is about, the parameters are just wrong, and you can all of these parameters can be understood in an intuitive sense. How effective is the vaccine? It can be understood, and so on. So that's an easier criticism to understand. So I just want to make the difference between those two kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, your question is, well, where do we get the data to derive the parameters that we then input into these models, or how does this all work? Well, the thing is, the parameters that you input are kind of deduced parameters from real things happening in the world that you observed as scientists. So they're parameters that are already partway into theory. They're not directly measurable. For example, you have what's called the R0, or the number of people that on average you infect in the society under the initial conditions. Well, that's already a theoretical concept. Okay, you don't measure that directly. You have to study a population and how quickly they get infected, and do tracing and do all kinds of things in
Are
order
we
just to
doing that?
estimate.
Is anyone doing that in
Oh
society?
yeah, the
Okay.
scientific literature is full of articles that try to estimate what is the true efficacy of the vaccines. What is the true how does transmission operate? This is what science does. We try to figure these things out. But there's what I'm trying to explain, though, is that there's a layer of parameters that are needed to input into these ultra simple models of reality. And those parameters themselves have to come from empirical measurements of what's going on with the disease. Okay. So
Like
the part about
real.
how you get the parameters, there's a lot of uncertainty there. There's a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of complexity in how you actually get those parameters to start with. And then if you agree what the parameters are, then there's the idea that you're using them somehow in this model, and there's complexity there as well. Okay, so that's the kind. So, for example, in our criticism, we pointed out that the number of people who are not immunized by full vaccination, that's something that they input in their model, right, as being 0.2, so 20%. And we point out that there is a detailed study in the community of how transmission is happening among people who live together. And that and when you analyze that data, when you look at what they found, a longitudinal study, a very detailed study where you're actually characterizing what the person's infected with and what their symptoms are, and you really look at it carefully, and you study several living groups like that, and you deduce the fractions that get infected despite the fact that they were fully vaccinated, then they get, instead of 0.2, their numbers would give us 0.66. So you go from 20% to 66%. And this is with the Delta variant. So the same variant that Fishman was talking about, there has been a study. And so that study, the empirical study, would generate that you should take that parameter to be 0.66 rather than 0.2. Well, that changes everything.
And how so? Can you explain that in very simple terms? Why is that so significant?
Well, that means that the vaccine efficiency that's assumed, 80%, is actually 34%. that means that vaccination has very little protection effect whatsoever.
And that's very
And so
significant
you would have to
psychologically.
model that more realistic situation and see what happens there. And you would have to not make an error in your model, and you would have to not introduce an ad hoc parameter which gives you the right answer, if you like. You'd have to not do all those things. You'd have to use that correct parameter and then see what happens. And that would be a different scenario.
This is, as I mean, I'm very clearly not a scientist, but what I worry about as an ethicist looking at an article like this is some of the language, like, when the authors say, quote unquote, the impact of the mixing of the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, and quote unquote, complete like with like mixing. It's very reminiscent of segregating language that we've seen with racial segregation. And we've worked very hard, I think, in Western societies to try to reduce the stigmatization of people with infectious diseases or other reasons for stigmatizing and segregating them, rather than trying to compound that stigmatization. One thing I'm curious about from you is, that kind of moral language is not something I see in scientific papers very often. Bioethics papers, yes, but not scientific papers. Is that surprising to you? Do you think that these authors are stepping outside of their scope of competency and reaching into some moral, cultural, ideological sort of grab bags to emphasize the conclusion they're trying to draw, to make it seem more like there's reason to be fearful and loathing of the unvaccinated than there really is?
Right. I'm going to open and close a parentheses quickly before I answer that question, that very deep question. And it's the following point that I want to make, is that what we pointed out in our criticism is not that the fundamental model, like, it's not an arithmetic error. It's not an obvious error.
Okay.
What they've done is they've taken values predicted by their model and made a whole new parameter, an index. And then they gave that index a meaning, which they're not entitled to give, because it doesn't mean what they say it means, okay? And so they fabricated an index in order to be able to say what they wanted to say. That's the impression that you get. And when I read the paper, it's palpable, let me say the pro-segregation, anti-individual freedom, pro-vaccine outlook is absolutely palpable in the way that this article is written. There's a stench of it, if you like, and that's unusual. Usually scientists are not that transparent in terms of their biases, okay? So I feel that it's palpable. One can argue this, but he they go out of their way explaining all the wonderful limits on freedom that are already legal in society, such as preventing people from smoke, secondhand smoke regulations, forcing people to wear seat belts in their cars, and so on. So it's almost like, we've done this before, we can do it again. That kind of discussion is very disturbing to me, in a scientific paper like this, because then the discussion becomes about it's legitimate to limit freedoms, not what the scientific results are, right?
And then letting the policy, ethical, legal questions get settled outside of the context of that paper. If I understand,
but you asked a broader question, and I want to address it the best I can. I would say the following thing. I think we have to admit that in society, well, there's a hierarchy. There are structures, there are institutions, there are influential people, and there are large networks of folks who fabricate narratives, basically tell lies, and who benefit from those narratives, who benefit from them in a real way, in terms of their societal status, in terms of the economic advantages they're going to derive from these narratives, and so on. So this is something that is part of our society, that you have these industries of networks that fabricate narratives. and and a lot of these networks are very powerful. They can buy universities, they can buy scientists, they can buy publishers, they can buy whatever they want. And so when they get into fabricating these narratives, they're not fooling around, and it's all you hear. And they have disproportionate influence in society, and the narratives are egregiously false. It's just
Is that what you
horrible.
think is going on here? Do you think these scientists, and I'm
Yes.
going to ask you, is this careless scientific work, or is there something more disingenuous at work? And who is ultimately to blame if this is poor science
Yeah.
and it's published in our top medical journal?
As a social scientist, I have to look at this in and analyze it in terms of the dominance hierarchy of society, the various networks that exist, the influences, where the money is, where power lies, who has an interest in achieving what, and I have to interpret it in these terms, unambiguously for me. And the other thing too is that these lies are so big to my mind as a scientist that it can't be just errors. It can't be just randomly, or it can't even be connected to reality. And so it's not about science. It's not about discovering truth, because the lies are just too big. And they're so big that it's even hard. When you start describing the nature of these lies, you sound crazy, because they're so big that they're everywhere in society. Everyone's accepted them. All the politicians, the media people, everyone's accepted these lies. And so even trying to explain the degree to which these lies are incorrect, you sound crazy.
Someone asked me once, what's wrong with a narrative anyway? And I said, well, nothing, as long as you're not begging the question. And it seems like that's what science like this might be doing, right? So you're starting with, as an assumption, what it is you're ultimately trying to prove. And that seems to be happening in various ways these days, doesn't it? And it seems like we have to be very careful not to inform our initial assumptions with ideological assumptions, with that we're not having a kind of cognitive bias in terms of the information we're picking and the information that we're ignoring.
Well, I think you're being way too kind to what's going on here. I look at Fishman et al.'s work, and I see that they concocted a parameter that is nonsensical, it does not at all. And we can talk about what that parameter is. If you want to go there, I'll explain it. But they concocted an index that would seem to indicate what their main conclusion is, but it's wrong. And then they, in addition to that, failed to look at a much simpler index, which would have told them the answer, which we graphed which we showed a graph of in our critique, which does not show, which is a hard thing that does not suffer from the error that they introduced, and which doesn't show what they're saying. And in addition to that, they failed to notice the contradictions in their own paper. We pointed out that the figures show that their index, which is, according to them, a measure of how nasty the unvaccinated are, shoots up as you increase the isolation between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated groups. So what they're saying is how dangerous the vaccinated people are, the unvaccinated people are, increases as you isolate the two groups up to the point of total isolation, where it has the maximum value. That's absurd. It's absurd. Okay. So and they didn't point that. Somehow they were silent on that. They showed the graph, but they were silent on, what it implies. They were also silent on the fact that this index, which they fabricated, drops significantly as the pathogen becomes more transmissible, more infectious. So as the R0 increases, this measure supposedly of how dangerous the vaccinated people drops to 0. Okay, so this would mean that the unvaccinated people become non-dangerous in terms of this proportionate concept, as the pandemic becomes more and more virulent. I mean, it's just crazy nonsense, right? And so this is right in their figures, and that it's a direct consequence of having introduced a nonsense index. And then we explained how and why this index is nonsense. That's what we explained accurately in our paper, you see.
We've got 1 minute left, and we're going to link your OCLA paper, the original paper, and so people can go and have a look at both of them. But any last words? I mean, would this paper have gotten published if the authors had made the corrections that you suggest?
Of course, because it's a hot topic in a sense. It's a topic of concern in society, and pretty much anything along these lines is going to get published these days. The journals are happy to do it because they're going to get a lot of readership from it and so on. So they didn't have to fabricate this index, and they didn't have to interpret things in the way that they did. And they didn't have to use the language that they did in order to justify curtailing freedoms and so on. They didn't have to any of that, and they still would have been published. Might not have had the splash.
They might not have made the evening news, though.
That's right.
Denis, thank you so much. I wish we had longer to go in depth, but as I said, you've got the paper that you wrote for OCLA. People can go in depth, and I'm sure if people have questions, that you would be happy to have a discussion with them. Thank you so much. I hope we chat again in the future.
All right, I'd be happy to. Bye now.
Thanks for hanging out with me today. If you enjoyed watching this video, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to the democracyfund.ca/donate.